Hello. Thank you for the opportunity to share this research with you. In the next 20 minutes, I want to cover some of the key ways in which overlapping crises are creating challenges in dealing with the shocks in the world today. There are three megatrends that are interacting to intensify this global crisis. One is demographics, where aging populations are closing the demographic windows of opportunity that countries have benefited from to increase human capital and raise labor productivity in the face of global challenges. Um, Technology has compounded these megatrends, both with digital divides, creating challenges for the most vulnerable, and now artificial intelligence creating a new kind of shocks. And in particular, climate change has interacted with these cascading and interacting crises to intensify vulnerability. In the face of this system of overlapping and cascading shocks, governments have responded, particularly with social protection measures. One of the lessons we saw from COVID, which itself was a multiple set of shocks. It was not just an epidemiological shock and not just an economic shock. It was also, perhaps even more importantly, a set of social and political shocks. The public health measures taken to mitigate this crisis were themselves policy shocks that intensified the economic and social consequences. And in doing so, it created a political shock, backlash against the policy measures. In fact, COVID was, in most of our lifetimes, the first time where the policy response to a crisis so intensively and extensively accelerated the social and economic consequences of the immediate crisis, the direct shock, the pandemic. And in this way, COVID is just like climate change. Climate change is creating a whole set of natural disasters all around the world. Cambodia is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, but African countries are also experiencing intensified extreme climatic events and stresses, like droughts that are intensifying vulnerability. But the policy response to climate change, the transition to green and sustainable economies, is also highly disruptive. And in the face of that disruption, we need policy responses like we did during COVID to help deal with the social and economic disruption. And social protection is one of the best ways to build this resilience. I want to explain how three waves of social protection programming have enabled countries to build resilience in progressively more complex ways. In the first wave, cash transfer programs, enabling people to cope with these shocks and deal with the consequences. In the second wave, more developmental approaches that have included development of human capital and economic inclusion programs have built core resilience, the ability to shrug off these shocks when they materialize. But on the horizon, we see a third wave, integrated climate development and equity strategies that are expanding resilience in more comprehensive, strategic, and developmental ways. The first wave emerged in the 1990s in countries in Latin America and in South Africa, particularly with the Child Support Grant, which demonstrated that particularly when you define poverty in money metric terms. Just giving money to the poor immediately tackled the most easily measured dimension of vulnerability. In Livingston, Zambia, in 2006, showcased the Kalomo social cash transfer pilot, which became Zambia's flagship program. Kenya, around the same time, was developing the OVC cash transfer program and the Hunger Safety Net program. Namibia, like South Africa, had a universal, or in South Africa's case, near universal, in Namibia, explicitly universal old age allowance, and then a child support grant. Ghana rolled out the Livelihoods Empowerment Against Poverty, and other countries, nearly every country in the world during the COVID crisis, expanded these cash transfer programs in order to build resilience in the face of shocks. But something else happened. Evaluations of these simple cash transfer programs demonstrated that without it even being the intent of these programs were building human capital. Families enrolled in cash transfer programs were sending children to school more regularly, enrolling children in school, keeping children in school, engaging in better health-seeking behavior. The children were more likely to be immunized. Mothers were more likely to access skilled birth facilities. And surprisingly, in spite of government policymaker concern about dependency, workers in households receiving these cash transfer programs wanted to work more, not less. They were not becoming dependent. Rather, these programs provided one of the most profound developmental impacts. They supported employment-seeking behavior. They strengthened livelihoods opportunities. And it provoked policymakers to ask the question, if we get all these developmental impacts from cash transfers without even trying, what would happen if we tried? And the answer to that question powered a second wave of social protection. Now, this second wave really had its roots in many of the first wave countries. In Latin America, cash transfer programs were often integrated with incentives to promote health-seeking and human capital development incentives. But in South Africa, which believed in more universal and unconditional programs, the concept of developmental social security had an even more powerful impact, particularly in Africa and Asia, where a process of policy diffusion, drawing lessons from the child support grant, and with South Africa hosting dozens of study tours and capacity building initiatives that showcased the child support grant, more and more countries began to adopt South Africa's approach of unconditional cash transfer programming. And the link of these cash transfers linked to developmental investments in human capital and livelihoods, like South Africa's expanded public works program, began to motivate for more livelihoods-oriented approaches. In Bangladesh, BRAC innovated graduation programs, multi-sectoral programs to link social protection support to assets and mentoring and social services and a comprehensive developmental approach. Rwanda's VUP is an example of a second wave program, as are Malawi's and Tanzania's social action funds. And we saw most recently in Cambodia, a family package that integrated these developmental human capital and livelihoods approaches with a commitment to leave no one behind. These developmental programs gave rise to livelihoods impacts contributing to economic growth that excited policymakers around the world. And we saw evidence unfold over the past decade of how these second wave programs have contributed to at least 14 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. But in the face of the current crisis in the global multilateral system, the resourcing for the first and second wave programs has faced enormous challenges. And as crises have become more complex and have intensified vulnerability, in spite of these first two waves of social protection programming, countries have begun to develop an even more strategic approach. This approach integrates social protection into more comprehensive development strategies. As COVID demonstrated, as I mentioned earlier, how a policy response to a complex crisis can be as costly as the shock itself, and as countries recognize the critical impact that climate change is generating, there is a growing recognition of the importance of a just transition to green and sustainable economies and societies. And there's a recognition that this transition will require a whole lot of adjustments in industrial policy, in labor markets, in technology. And these adjustments will be enormously disruptive. And there will be a need for a social dimension to the strategy for these adjustments. And we see the underpinnings of this third wave going back to, for example, Costa Rica's programs that provide payments through social protection programming for environmental services. In South Africa, in the Expanded Public Works Program, a Working for Water program, a public works program that had a powerful climate impact. It preserved Cape Town's water table sufficiently that when the city began to run out of water in the last decade, this Working for Water impact narrowly averted the world's first major city from running out of water. Similarly, the Expanded Public Work programs Working on Fire, helped deal with some of the most devastating impacts of climate change. Microinsurance initiatives expanded the potential of social protection programming to help people deal with these kinds of shocks. Brazil's Bolsa Verde and Ecuador's programming helped integrate climate change adaptation and mitigation with social protection programming. But today we see an even more powerful set of investments, with social protection being woven integrally into complex developmental programming. One of the best examples is Davao's, in the Philippines, mass transit modernization program. Mass transit, buses, and roadways, special lanes for buses, that sounds like infrastructure, not social protection. But the way they designed it was to take diesel guzzling, unsafe taxis off of the road, but provide protection for those most affected by this, by the drivers of these vehicles who resisted these green transitions, but were now being provided with the full market value of their vehicles if they flattened them into a metal pancake at a dump and received a certificate that they could exchange for the cash value of their now demobilized vehicle. And they were offered training and opportunities to drive these hydrogen-fueled buses. They now had access to healthcare, to decent and safe work. And these buses did not go from the suburbs to the financial center, but from the poorest, most vulnerable communities to where the jobs were. And they provided low cost or free fares for people who could not afford transportation. And to address the problem of harassment that so many people experienced in the previous mass transit system, they put security cameras on the buses so people would feel safe. This is not infrastructure. This is social protection dressed up as infrastructure. It is an integrated climate development and equity investment. And we see this third wave in examples in the Philippines that I just mentioned, in China, with an investment in solar grids that benefited energy-poor communities and generated financial resources that could be channeled into social assistance payments. In Nepal, with a land use management policy that empowered communities to protect forests, protecting land, and sequestering carbon. We see this in Indonesia and South Africa with the just energy transition strategies. These are integrated programs that first ensure a transition to green and sustainable energy systems, and they provide developmental impacts through new sectors of employment, through new kinds of green infrastructure. And they all have social dimensions that protect equity and the opportunity for the most vulnerable. And we see a similar example in Zambia with its new strategy to build on the fruits of its social cash transfer program that has taken advantage of a demographic dividend to empower a new generation with an unprecedented intensity of human capital development. And that enables Zambia, with its newly discovered rare earth materials, to say to the rest of the world, we will not follow the example that we did with our copper mining industry and allow outside exploitation of these resources. We will not export these minerals. We will beneficiate them into electronic vehicle batteries. We will benefit from these raw materials to complement the human capital that our social protection programs have developed and build new and empowering livelihoods, decent work within our country. Kenya with its green hydrogen hub, Uganda with its green energy transition strategy, and other countries around the world are recognizing the critical links between social protection, human capital development, and decent livelihoods, empowering a third wave of social protection programming. And it's just in time, because in the face of the global multilateral crisis, the old financing framework for social protection is not coming back. And so governments around the world, many of which have relied intensively on the global development system for healthcare, for support for education, and particularly for social protection, are working to adjust and identify how will financing work going forward. And this third wave illustrates the contours of a new financing framework, which is rooted first and foremost in Global South leadership. One of the major critiques of the first wave of social protection was that it was often a donor-driven agenda. I don't agree, although critics make a compelling case that in some countries, development partners played an outsized role in helping to shape social protection investments. The second wave changed that because second wave outcomes in terms of human capital development and employment creation aligned very closely with the core goals of government policymakers. But in the face of the current crisis, with development support shrinking across the board, the new role for global South governments are, these roles are more important than ever. And a recent study asked samples of people in over 100 countries around the world, 125 countries, a survey that included 130,000 respondents. Would you give up 1% of your income in order to invest in more effective climate action? And guess which countries of the world had a population most willing to make this sacrifice? Not the richest countries of the world. Not even 2 out of 3 people in these countries would make this sacrifice. But in Latin America, in Asia, and in Africa in particular, we saw an overwhelming willingness. Nearly 3/4 of people in Latin America and Africa were willing to give up 1% of their income for climate action. And that's particularly important because in the next decade, the GDP of countries that are currently middle-income countries will exceed the GDP of upper-income countries today, which means with both the willingness and the capacity to resource a global multilateral development system, the leadership of the world order of global development will fall to these countries. This will require new roles for development partners. Before, they were mainly a source of financial resources for development. Now, the goodwill and the understanding and knowledge will create other opportunities for them to share their global knowledge and contribute to the global multilateral system. And private finance coming through the climate sector will become more important than ever, not because it's the right thing to do, but as the head of America's Insurance Association recently said, climate change is destroying capitalism. The private sector will realize in the face of intensifying tragedies like the one we saw in Texas this past week, that climate action is in everybody's self-interest. And it will align with the leadership of the Global South and the new role of development partners to recognize that this is a global public good. And there will be new roles for a new philanthropy, where an emerging class of philanthropists will not be donors, but rather partners and allies with the Global South in driving this financing framework forward. I want to conclude with 3 main points here. The first wave of social protection demonstrated to us more than anything that a simple instrument, a core cash transfer program, can build resilience in powerful ways. And as we're going to hear more, digital technologies, which helped to propel this first wave and proved so vital during COVID, can complement cash transfers. Just as cash transfers were the first viral app for social protection, welfare improving information transfers, WITS, can prove another viral app. in this first wave of social protection, helping to reach and protect the most vulnerable. The second key lesson from wave 2 is that integrating these core instruments, be them cash or technology and information, with a whole range of developmental investments, particularly in human capital and in livelihoods, and particularly supporting this through digital platforms like single registries that can break down silos and build bridges across sectors, can strengthen the developmental synergies and multiply these impacts. And third, social protection, of course, strengthened by new investments in digital inclusion, can provide the glue that binds together the planks of integrated climate action, development, and economic justice programming. And this can ensure that equity, leaving no one behind, remains central to the major social transformations the green transition will require. And integrating social protection into these comprehensive investments opens the door to what are now just billions, but in the coming decades will grow to trillions of dollars in development finance, integrated through a new platform, an integrated multi-pillar system that makes partners of global South governments, traditional development partners, including the United Nations, as well as international financial institutions and bilateral donors, along with the private capital that stems from climate finance and new philanthropy. Thank you.